What about Martha? When my mother was taking her last breaths a few weeks ago, my siblings and I began to write her obituary. She wasn't responsive, but we would show it to her sometimes just to make sure we were on the right track. We were texting each other back and forth, lifting up the details of her life, trying to capture her 85 years in a few words for the good people of Longview, Texas to read in the Longview News Journal. We were making sure to include the various family members who had both survived and predeceased her, and one of us asked, "What about Martha?" You see, my mother had an older sibling, a sister named Martha. And let me pause really quickly. Let me interrupt myself for a moment to say, one of the great privileges and heavy responsibilities of being a clergy person is officiating at funerals and memorial services. The side-by-side emotions of celebrating a life well lived and grieving a death are complicated. Pain and pleasure, as the choir sang in the introit. And today is All Saints Sunday, as we have said, that Sunday on the Christian calendar when we remember those who have died. And I'm going to talk about the dead and about their presence with us. And specifically, I'm going to talk about two children who died very young. And I say that to acknowledge how terribly tragic the death of a child can be. And so if any of you need to take a big breath, that is okay. And if you're watching online and you need to click pause on the stream and go get a cup of coffee or go for a run and join this service another time or never click back on it again, that's okay. And if you're here in the room and you need to step outside or need to reach over and take a hand of someone near you, or if you see someone near you who you think needs a hand and they're okay with you grabbing their hand, then that is more than okay. So what about Martha? One of my siblings asked. My mother's older sibling, Martha, was born 7 years before my mother, and she lived only a little over a year. My mother never knew her, and my grandparents never mentioned her. Because grief is hard, and we all come to it in different ways. My grandparents never, not once, mentioned their firstborn child. But knowing a little of what I do about those grandparents, I could say that their never mentioned child was always present in their lives. We are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. It's a line from the Christian scriptures that you heard already this morning. We are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. We have these photographs around the room today. Some of you brought photographs of your family members and friends and neighbors. These are some of the saints in our lives. Some of these are photographs that I dug out of our church archives of church members gone by. Some of them are citizens, fellow citizens whose names we do not know. These are the saints of this day. In a moment, you're going to have an opportunity to go around and visit these saints if you want to. Hold on, we'll do that in a moment. I know that some of you listen to the podcast Poetry Unbound with the Irish writer Padraig Ó Tuama. A few episodes ago, he explored the poem Learning About Constellations by Sadiq Zukogi. Sadiq Zukogi is a professor at Mississippi State University, and the Zukogi and his wife had a child who died very young, a little girl named Baha. Like my mother's older sister, Martha, Baha only lived a little while past her first birthday, and her father wrote this poem. Today, Baha is not dead. She is 12 years old. She sits beside a flower vase, presses her thumb to the clay. Her heart buds into a magnificent sun. Water falls its warmth all over her satin face. Taller than all her classmates, in the corner she leans her head to white paper, carves moons out of her notebook, while other children sit and listen to the teacher. The class is learning about constellations. She takes colors off a flower, folds it to her skin. A chameleon gathering quotes from leaves. She questions daisies, reveals all suggestions when he stares into her eyes. Baha grabs a speck of darkness, molds it into a moth, and places it in the darkest point in his eyes. He sits close to his daughter in the yard, joins her and the moths. Baha is not dead. She is walking her way into myth, a world of new constellations where buried milk nourishes the placenta to heal his broken bones. Broken eggshells of his heart mend each back together with the energy of a clock that never stops moving backward. Walking her way into myth. It's one of the lines from that poem that grabbed my heart. Myth, that doesn't mean fantasy or made-up tales like we sometimes think it does. A myth may not be factual, but myths are true. Myths are the stories that give us meaning, that help us understand ourselves. Baha died at age 1 year and 21 days. In the poem, Baha is not dead. She is 12 years old, walking her way into myth, mending the broken eggshell of her father's heart. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Friends, we are part of something far greater than we can imagine. Much is being made these days. Much is being made of the decline of the American Protestant Church. Part of the reason for that decline is that we have not yet remembered the enormity of what we are about. We spend our time on the details of spreadsheets and church growth plans, and we have not yet remembered that really our calling is to fall down in awe at the presence of God's countenance. We've opted for small self-help plans and tied ourselves to political platforms and not yet remembered that our hearts are brave enough to truly live in the abundance of God's blessing. We have not yet remembered to grasp in our bones the reality that we are part of the enormity of the universe. We are one with all things. We've worried about making good church members or productive citizens, and we have not yet remembered to make meaning of our lives. We've bound Christianity in American culture to either the left or the right, and we've not yet remembered to walk into myth. We've settled for the small satisfactions of parochial pride and not yet remembered to take the risk of living altered lives that are open to the beauty of having our hearts bud into magnificent suns. Psalm 67 that Jim led us in reading earlier says in verse 1, "May God be merciful to us and bless us." And then the psalmist goes on to say in verse 2 that God's mercy, God's blessing is for all nations. Verse 3 says God loves the peoples, plural, and then says again the peoples. Verse 4 says the nations and the peoples and all the peoples upon earth. Verse 5 says twice the peoples. And verse 7 says all the ends of the earth. Friends, that is epic. That is inclusive, that is expansive, that is bigger than Bethesda, Maryland, and bigger than the United States of America, and bigger than our anxious political lives would tell us. There is no us or they, no you or me. There is only all. Not our people and your people, not my party and your party, not this country or that country. God's saving health is for one holy we. God's bigness, God's goodness, God's embrace reaches out with a breadth and width of being that includes all peoples of the earth. And as God's love reaches out with breadth and width to include human life of every place, so too God's love reaches down into the past and up into the future to include all of time, backward and forward. You see, God's love is cruciform. Historians say that Jesus was likely crucified on a single spike stuck in the ground near a trash dump outside of town. The ancient myth makers knew what they were doing when they morphed that single spike into an intersecting cross of faith that we see before us. A cross with arms that reach out left and right to include every living being, and arms that reach down to dig toward roots we can barely remember, and reach up to invite us into futures we can't yet conceive. Life is not limited to our feeble struggle, as the hymn says. Life is not limited, faith is not limited to our plodding Protestantism or our problematic politics. Love is not limited to what we know and see. And Baha is not dead, and she is 12 years old. And you and I are not alone. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We are wrapped in song. And we will not die, but we shall be changed from glory into glory at the twinkling of an eye into saints of light. Sometimes I play a game when I preach. Sometimes when I climb into the pulpit, and it's a bit of a climb. Sometimes when I climb into the pulpit, I sometimes imagine that Loring Chase or Moses Lavelle is here with me. They're former pastors of this church. Their pictures are around on the ledges. Eleanor Roosevelt once preached at this church, once spoke at this church when the congregation was located at Mount Pleasant. And through the mystery of God's connectivity, I imagine that when the church moved here and built a new pulpit, her spirit came here too. And so sometimes I imagine that Eleanor Roosevelt is here with me. And Julian Bond, one of the coordinators of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, spoke here. And sometimes I imagine that he stands here with me. We are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Moses Lavelle was the pastor here in the 1920s. He preached a sermon in the 1920s about the need for women's reproductive rights. I don't know why he preached that sermon. I can't find the background on that in the archives, but I can imagine that he preached that sermon because he had seen the agony and insecurity and male toxicity that led to injustice and grief in his day. And that sermon is a part of this place and is a requiem of the saints. I mentioned the failure of the modern American church. One of our failures is that we've made church all about happiness and smiles. I can't help but think that sermon in the 1920s was born of grief and sorrow. And I believe that the cloud of witnesses knows your grief and welcomes your tears. Moses Lavelle later preached a sermon to this congregation declaring pacifism to be the only way he could see to follow Christ. Because you see, he was not only a preacher, he had been a soldier in World War I, and he knew the sin and sting and horror of war. We pretend that church is about progress and optimism and getting better and better in every way. I think the cloud of witnesses wraps us in song because they know that life is full of great pain. In 1972, Senator George McGovern lost the presidential race in one of the biggest losses ever. He was stomped by Richard Nixon. And the Nixons had been participants here at Westmoreland in the 1950s. Because clouds of witnesses are complicated, right? And the Sunday after George McGovern lost, in epic style, in November of 1972, the Sunday after that loss, he came to church here. And he sat on the back row. And I know this because one of the women who was an usher that day told me that she gave him a bulletin and also told him she'd voted for him. And he sat on the back row because saints are not always winners. Losers gather around us in love because we're losers too. One of my favorite TV shows these days is Reservation Dogs. I highly recommend it, and yes, I'm recommending a very graphic, very profane TV show. It's outstanding. It's about indigenous people, particularly about 4 indigenous teenagers who are sequestered, to use a word from the choral introit. They are living on tribal land in Oklahoma. The show is important to my family because Amy and our children are citizens of the Cherokee Nation. It's a beautiful show. It's a desperate show. One of the teenagers is a young woman, a teenage girl named Willie Jack. And there comes an episode in the show as it builds and builds where things seem really sad and bleak, where Willie Jack is especially afraid. She's terribly sad. Her friends are going through a difficult time. She's grieving. Their life is falling apart. She has a really wise cousin. That wise cousin happens to be in jail because sometimes that's where saints are. And so Willie Jack goes to visit her cousin in jail. It is a bleak, bare, stark, run-down, concrete block prison. And Willie Jack explains to her wise cousin that she doesn't know what to do. And her cousin says, first of all, buy me some chips from the vending machine. And then they sit down, and the cousin says, hold out your hands. Close your eyes. Breathe. Remember. And listen. Listen for the ancestors, the healers, the caregivers, the people who've carried us thus far on the way. Listen for the people who buried their babies on forced marches, who sang songs of despair in the night. And in a profound moment of TV at its best, the ancestors showed up. In that prison, a group of ancestors show up and surround that teenage girl and her inmate cousin. They don't say anything. One of them starts to sing, and they're just there. And in that moment, you realize that in all the dreadful prisons, physical and emotional, where people are held unjustly, in all the bleak corners of the earth, in the broken eggshells of the hearts of sad teenage girls and fathers sitting on playgrounds at schools, and in our den as we watch TV on Massachusetts Avenue, and in your lives, the ancestors show up. We are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. So what about Martha? Of course we included her in the obituary, that unknown, always present sister. She died when she was just over a year old, and now she is 92. And is alive in that great cloud of witnesses. And maybe she's singing to her never-seen younger sister. A lullaby of primal eloquence, wrapping all of life in song. Listen. Listen for the requiem. Listen for the love songs.